Hello everyone, I'm Jim Masters, and welcome to CUTV News. This is the show where we talk to today's top thinkers from all around the world to bring you information, inspiration, and thought-provoking ideas that you can put to use in your personal or professional life right now. Today, my special guest is Susan Hodgkinson. Susan is a leadership management expert, internationally recognized keynote speaker, and executive coach. She's also the author of the new leadership book, The Dignity Mindset, a leader's guide to building gender equity at work. Drawing on her decades of coaching and consulting, backed by a wide range of academic and business research, Susan has highlighted the factors that inhibit true inclusion, providing concrete strategies and program ideas to help companies finally deliver on their talent management and inclusion objectives. The Dignity Mindset offers new, thoughtful, insightful solutions with a system-wide, concrete, actionable set of steps your organization can take right now with everyone's involvement to create a winning approach to gender equity. To discuss her new book and more, Susan Hodgkinson joins me in the CUTV News studio right now for an exclusive interview. Sue, welcome to the CUTV News studio.
Thank you so much. Nice to see you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. And how was your trip down from Boston?
All was good. It's fall. It was really a treat coming down. And, fall in New England, we can't beat it. Oh,
absolutely.
It's good. Yeah.
You know, fascinated by your work and your passion and your mission. Tell us about the dignity mindset. How do you define what that actually is?
Great way to start, very important. Let's think of the dignity mindset as an idea that, our belief system about other people in our work life and in our lives in general is that every person arrives on the planet with the same value and worth as every other and has the same basic human needs, which you might remember, from school days with Abraham Maslow, right? So we have the same value and worth. Respect has to be earned through, we're talking about work, through job performance, but also the needs for safety, shelter, esteem, belongingness, and ultimately self-actualization are shared across every person on this planet, and certainly regardless of gender. And that's really very important because it's the underlying premise of the book, and the fact is that we're here to talk about gender equity and why it's stuck and how to move it. And what we know is when we go out to organizations and say, let's change these 4 behaviors to, let's target these behaviors to make changes. No, it's not going to work if change hasn't been made at the belief system level. So the change begins in my own mind, in my own beliefs, and then the behaviors follow from that. And that's why this plea for change really starts with what has to happen first.
So where did this idea of, dignity mindset actually come from? What was the initial inspiration for you to make this such a driving force for you and a passion in all the work that you're doing and everything that is related to it?
Well, dignity is such an important word, and I think growing up even, I was in one of those houses where it was always treat other people with dignity and respect. That was and then as I went through my work, which has really been the bulk of my career as an executive coach primarily, but as a leadership development advancer more broadly, one of the things that I had asked for from the beginning of the work was to the HR folks who send me coachees, please send me high potential, high performing, that's for sure who I want to be working with, but also as diverse as is the talent. So I don't want to only be seeing straight white men, no offense, because we know that great talent shows up in all kinds of packages and bundles. And so from the beginning, while I was being educated, working with this diverse array of fantastic people, truly, I really began to understand that the idea that dignity is something that belongs for everybody is important, but it's not a belief everybody shares. And what ends up happening is the result we have, of course, in our broader society, but in work, what I'm aiming to do in this book is convince leaders to do better and to create a society of dignity where things like the best talent can come forward, be it by gender or any other way that might be different from the traditional, typically straight white male core power structure.
What are some of the other things that have surprised you along the way as you've sort of researched and investigated this and brought things to life further, Sue?
Well, it came to light because I was frustrated. I had a coaching portfolio, very balanced, all kinds of different great people, but it was like the third or fourth iteration of incredibly talented women who were having confidence issues. And I have to say, I pride myself in my work to come up with very unique and, personalized or customized solutions to the person I'm coaching. That's the gift of one-on-one work. So when the organization invests in me, I think there's an expectation that we're not going to pull something off a shelf. And I could not get an answer to, an advancement of, a way to move forward for this one issue on confidence. As hard as I tried, all the different ways, I at one point realized I was bringing cognitive behavioral therapy into the meetings and so then I said, wait a minute, something's not right here. And I began to look not inward only at what can we control ourselves, which is important because I'm a person who deeply believes in self-determinism. Let's not blame barriers that are in our way. Let's just move beyond them and be clever about the ways we're going to have to come up with to do that. But gee, what's happening here? And, the discovery was that there's a deeply, deeply, deeply ingrained set of beliefs around gender that show up in our society at birth. Right when we're supposed to be having that idea that dignity means that everyone arrives with the same value and worth, what's actually happening is the cloak of how we're supposed to behave based on whether we're male or female, which at this point obviously is already an outdated binary idea.
It's
but
that
if
patriarchal way of thinking.
Yes, it's right. And that cloak comes in 100 different ways, but study after study, and one in particular, the Journal of Adolescent Health published in 2017, a really important article that looked at when do the gender stories start to get told that shape how males and females behave. 29 country study, the US was included, and all it did was validate again that men are taught from very early on that they're to be sort of the ones with the power, the ones that are to be ashamed if they don't have power. They need to be the ones in control and to be ashamed again if they don't have it. And ultimately, that their role is to function as a predator. And women, therefore, are taught you're the person who's got to cover up, who's vulnerable, who better be quiet in big spaces and don't draw attention to that whole thing. And it shows up as a baby, and it moves on through early and middle school, and then it moves on through high school, and then we know what happens in college, where 1 in 4 women today is sexually assaulted on a U.S. campus. And think of Maslow's needs being violated every step of that way, right, for self-esteem, belonging. And so what we arrive at is a population going through college and arriving at our doors at work already with these headsets in themselves, and the idea is we have to undo them and bring back or introduce for the first time the idea that dignity, and that is to say a belief and a commitment in your behaviors to everyone sharing the same value and worth, is really what we have to be about if we're going to succeed in this organization and reap the benefits of gender balance, which are profound at this point.
So are we making any progress? Do you find that we're moving in the right direction, or are we not moving quick enough, or are there areas where we're not moving at all? What have you observed in your research?
Well, it's a little bit, I hate to say it, sort of all of that, but on the big, anecdotally, there are some organizations and some individuals and some leaders who are doing really wonderful things. As a whole, when we look at the big metrics that help us understand whether there are really sea change shifts, it's stuck as stuck can be. It's like, Mary Tyler Moore and, talking about the pay gap in 1970 with Lou Grant is still a conversation women are struggling to have. That's ridiculous. So what I think is true is that this whole thing, which now is backed by the compelling data on business performance that says if we've got at least 30% women on boards, women in the C-suite, women in senior leadership roles, never mind women as the CEO, we're going to see on average a 1% increase in net margin, which for the average Fortune 500 is moving from 6% net margin to 7%. That's a really big number. And there's an attached piece now, since that's sort of stuck and proven and we're not still arguing it's not really true, that in fact there's an innovation intensity that's producing more patents when there are women-led companies like in biotech. And just to attach a thought to that, because I think it's really important, all of us need to be incredibly concerned about large segments of our population that are going to be unemployable as the STEM community moves to these, more broader segments of how organizations are showing up and what talents and schooling are needed, because we're also in our early messaging continuing to tell women they're not good at math. Mm-hmm. And that's a proven statistic. In Iceland, where they have gender balance and men and women are seen as equal, according to the World Economic Forum, see the study, third year in a row, women outperform men in math. It's not some sort of thing we acquired in our genetics. No, it's what we're told, and then it happens. But to your original question, what really is the problem is that men continue to treat this as though it's an elective, and it's not an elective. Leadership fails when it's treating it in its organization as something that, well, it's, let's have the women's group and they can do really important things for the women. No. The whole thing is going to stay just like it is until the men start to show up, either of their own volition or because leaders decide to get on board with something called inclusion. And most leaders are failing miserably at that right now. So
the shift has to happen. There is this stuckness or resistance. They're treating it as an elective. Why would you say they're doing that? Is there fear? Are they confused? Or are men just not knowing what to do, how to say certain things? Is it changed for them in ways where they're just struggling themselves, or they're just like, I'm not going to deal with that because I don't have to?
It's
all of the above.
It's such a great question, because it is all of the above. And it's like we wouldn't paint anybody with one brush ever in this discussion or in society generally ever. But it could be any one or a number of those reasons. It's interesting, though, that, for the research in the first half of the book, which was very laborious, but the work had to be done to outline how serious and deep the problem goes, so that we could explain in the second with a bunch of solutions that, if you don't tie solutions to what are the deep and sort of deeply ingrained, if we want to say unconscious issues, nothing's going to change because beliefs don't change. One of the things that we know is, when men think, they hear there's a women's leadership meeting, and like in the last 2 years since Me Too, I speak at a lot of those. The host is always saying, please be sure that it's inclusive of men, because we're really trying to get men to come to our meetings. And so I really do try to be inclusive to men, and the men don't show up. And you think, when they don't show up, what is your initial thought? Why that's happening? I think they don't think it's for them. It's a women's thing, that's not for me. And if you think about things that I actually found pretty interesting in the research that happened earlier in life, which is where we have to go back to figure this out. There's this really interesting work, actually done in the 70s by a researcher in the UK, a husband-wife team. The wife is Laura Mulvey. She pioneered the research, and it was looking at what she called popular film. I'll call it mass media. And it was really all about how do women and men show up in the construction of relationships portrayed in film. And she came up with this very clear notion that it's through something called the male gaze. And this actually relates to your question, and I tell you why. The male gaze is the idea that film or any other ways that, huge pieces of our culture. So it was in film in the 70s. It's now in video games. It's in virtual reality. It's in a lot of TV and other media. That the woman's place and construction in those experiences, including first-person active participation in video, which is highly problematic for what we're talking about today, is as an object to satisfy needs of the men. How she's positioned literally in the film, what her role is in the film, the man being always taller, so lots of times when there are shorter male leads than the female lead, she is here and he's put on a box so that he's standing taller so she can be gazing up at him. I mean, that's literally the male gaze in film, and it's how we're taught to see the role and relationship of power between the genders. And also that women have a role to play in our lives, I guess, because we see all these films and 8 million other impressions now, of course, social media, where the woman, again, is in a situation where she's subordinated to the man. And so when
is there also the sexualization still going
very
on
highly
of
sexualized,
women, right?
very highly sexualized, yeah, and especially in places where it's unchecked, right? So let's go through social media, the major platforms of which were formed by guys whose first foray into that work was to exploit women. Run down the list and I can pull you the data. That's a problem, and it's a big one.
So what do you say to a young girl who is on something like Instagram and feels compelled to take all these selfies and all these provocative photos and post them to get the attention, to get the likes? Where is that mindset coming from? Because there's a lot of people on social media that are doing that, looking for that appreciation or the acceptance. It's really empty stuff.
It's empty.
But why are they geared towards doing that, and why is it such a compulsion all of a sudden for people to be doing that now?
I mean, all of those mechanisms, I think, have put us in a place as a population, as a culture, and now, of course, it's global, where we want to look at that lens of how we can portray some sort of a best self, which, as we all know, isn't real. And it's dangerous, I think. It's very dangerous. Suicides are going up, the depression's gone up, the intensity of anxiety in kids has gone up. Somebody was laughing the other day, actually, because a young gentleman was at age 27 talking about feeling desperately burned out. And this person is much older, and it's, gee, I don't, how can he be burned out? And I actually thought about it and thought, that's probably quite possible. Not only demands of work, but also the 24/7, and also how you're supposed to show up and so forth. But what we are teaching about how to use a device that so quickly can become toxic is where this all, I think, lives. And so it is about what we teach in our house. It is about how we manage what kids are exposed to and when. There's a story that came out last year about a mom and a dad and a young daughter they had sitting together playing what was a G-rated video game, and they were just trying to engage with the girl in something that, and all of a sudden a rape scene came up, and this kid is 6. And, obviously it was just this hugely traumatizing problem for them for some long time, but it's like, when did that become okay?
So there's a normalization of all of this that's happening that infiltrates what we're talking about here. These are things that add to this disparity and the lack of the equity. These things are sort of reinforcing it, and some people are buying into those things, which just exacerbates it all, where there are those who are not. But it's not doing anything to help the cause, is it? It's not. And the idea, that we think about, if we came back to media of all sorts, really, and there's still this idea that that's a women's film, so it's not for me as a man. And there was a game we played in the book at one point where we showed a listing of films that you might see on a flight if you were lucky enough to be on a flight showing films. And I gave a list, and I gave this list and said, look at all these film options.
you know, and it would happen to be a list of all women-led films that passed the Bechdel test. Maybe we can talk about that later, but, you know, female heroines and so forth, and female leads. And so the whole list was like, which ones of these would you choose? And then, you know, read through and then said, wait, here's another list. And then it was basically the whole actual list off of one of the large U.S. carriers' recent flights I was on, and I took a picture of the, you know, honestly, to see 7,000 iterations of Keanu Reeves and whatever that movie was. That list was like, okay, that's a men's list, effectively, right? And what I guess we have to say is, if it's for men, it's for all of us. But if it's for women, it's still, well, that's a women's film, that's a women's meeting. It's not an elective. It's not. And so leadership, where in these organizations would invest in a Women's Leadership Day, for example, and be okay that no men showed up, are failing fundamentally in their roles. They really are.
So there's all these things coming at us that, again, can make things rather confusing. So sometimes people retreat. Instead of taking it, you know, head on and working through it, they back off, say, oh, I'm not an expert at this, so I'm not going to become an expert at this. I'm not going to have any understanding because I'm not an expert. So they retreat, which just makes things worse, right?
It so does. And so I think that's a really reasonable thing to do, number one. I think first of all, there are a lot of really great guys of all colors in this world. And I'm happy to have a lot of them in my own life, so I begin there. And I think men right now are probably more confused than ever have they been about. I had a really nice gentleman the other day who I didn't know was in front of me at a door, and he literally stopped, and he was like, and he looked at me, and he said, "Madam, I'm sorry." It was a British gentleman. He said, "Madam, I'm sorry. I honestly don't know if I should hold this door for you," and I froze. And we laughed, and I said, "Oh my gosh, isn't that lovely of you that you're at least wondering?" And by the way, I'd be delighted for that, as I would be delighted to hold it for someone else if that was the right thing that day. But I really do think that's where the idea of leadership comes in. If we could just focus on leaders in business for a minute. First of all, let's give up on the idea that anybody outside of business is going to show us what it means to lead, and especially to lead in an inclusive way. None of the structures in our society at large, which includes all the media, and it also, frankly, includes government, are set up to promulgate inclusion and to lift people who belong in the mix into that mix. In organizations, we can say it's an economic irresponsibility. It's failing your fiduciary responsibility to ignore what the difference is in profits when you do or don't lead inclusively. And so when you look at the leader's work in this whole situation in an organization, one, it requires those who are straight white men in a straight white core power structure, which doesn't mean you're evil, but it does mean you are not aware, really, of a lot of the things that are challenges for people who aren't like you. Just take the lesson. Leaders are great learners, the successful ones. This is a place that has to go and be learned. And so I think that leaders have to have a journey that they've taken to a place where they have really lived in the shoes of people who don't show up at work every day with the same experience as they may have had that morning or that last year or for their lives. And understand how different it is for people, especially women and people of color, in our organizations, and what that leader needs to know to then become a teacher, right? And start the work of bringing awareness through vulnerability and a clarity that he can share, because it's usually a gentleman, of what he learned when he became vulnerable and opened himself up to not needing to be perfect, but needing to be educated and starting to bring that work forward like you would any other big change initiative in your company. Somehow when it comes to gender, that's an elective.
Yeah. Right, exactly. So let's talk about how you facilitate the work that you do? Do you go into companies? Do you create workshops? Is it one-on-one? How do you strategize it and how do you implement it from the beginning when you're working with people?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. And what happens is first we get them educated by going through how did we get to this?
Because knowledge is power, right?
Knowledge is really power. And if you don't feel really compelled and understand how deep the problem goes, you're going to do, perhaps as a leader, one of those naive things like say, oh, listen, let's decide that we want to bring more women into meetings and be sure that every woman talks at a meeting, or some back-end behavior absent a strategy, absent a belief system.
Okay. So
right?
the woman spoke, that's enough, that type of thing.
Get women
right?
talking more at meetings,
Almost
guys. Come
like
on.
meeting a quota or something, right?
Exactly. And it's absent those things behind it. Without the belief system change, it won't happen. So what we do is we bring the awareness and do it in, I think, a compelling but inclusive way, because this work is really intended to talk to men who are in leadership roles, first and foremost, and say, I don't want you on your heels. I want you on your toes. So let's help get that started. And that means you have to understand the experience of women around the world and how it shows up when they come in to work for you. Then let's stop the idea of trying to fix women, right? And make all the women be like all the men are, because then everything would work. So that's when sometimes people talk about the difference between equality and equity. And if we just say, oh, everyone just needs to be the same and I'll see everyone as the same, not quite, because it's still set up as an environment that was built on a set of male behaviors and ideology. So in part 2 of this book, it's 7 solutions. When we work with companies, after we've given probably a keynote, which is usually how this starts, with a leadership team or at a leadership meeting, people are like, oh my God, we've got to do something, and that's exactly where we want them. So there are seminars that we'll come in and do to help break down where are the pillars and parts of this ecosystem where we can begin to work it. And just like any other change process, you don't start like with accountability first, like you will all have 50% women on your teams in 2 years. No, that's not going to make it work, and it's going to lead to a lot of resentment. But could we roll it out first the leader's got to be there, and the leader has to be vocal, but then with education and deep education, which in our work is let's model for you what education on inclusion looks like, and we did it in the book as something called the Inclusion Institute. May never have a piece of brick or mortar, but it is intended to say, yep, we have a lot of things to teach everybody, but no longer is this, let's put women out and sort of fix them so they can come back and do the thing. Because there's a lot of education for men. If we really think about this as dignity, right, that has to get done. So one thing in the Inclusion Institute is what's the curriculum for men? And a big piece of what is built into it is teaching back empathy, because through especially first-person video games, which, I mean, it's stack upon stack of data that we are talking about what happens to kids' brains in those first-person video games. And boys gel their friendships around those games. And if you look at Grand Theft Auto 5, for example, 30 hours of playable content, there's not one playable female in this whole game. Not that I would particularly want to see one, but there are 3, I think, types of women: prostitutes, I think there's a stripper, and there's a feminist in there that you laugh at on your way to winning whatever you win in Grand Theft Auto 5 through the violence. So all that empathy gets lost, especially in a first-person experience. And so even here with this...
Yeah, what do we have there? I see these funky-looking glasses and...
What we've discovered with virtual reality, which is what this is, these goggles where you place them over your eyes and, become part of the world that's programmed through it, is that you can save a whole lot of time and money bringing a first-person experience of how it feels to be somebody else into an hour of a gentleman's day. And yes, this is targeted for men. because of all the things that have been offered to men to help them forget that women are people too, with the same needs as men have. So one of the cool things in the Institute is there's a lot of learning for men to do, and a lot of it can happen without sending them away to big seminars, without big retreats, although I'm not averse to having a leader bring his other male leaders together at retreats and begin to talk about what they need to do differently. But imagine spending an hour and coming out of it understanding really what you became a woman, showing up at work, getting catcalled on her way to work.
So you're actually spending time in her shoes, seeing what it's like when you put these on. It sort of creates those images in those glasses, virtual reality glasses.
Yeah, it's called identity tourism.
That's really cool stuff.
Yeah.
That's really on the cutting edge.
It really is, and now there are more than one vendor in the U.S. who are providing these tools through VR for empathy because they're so time effective.
So when this is programmed in and you put these glasses on and you witness everything you're witnessing through the glasses, what's been some of the feedback? What are the men saying? Wow, I didn't realize, I didn't understand, I really didn't appreciate what happens, or they even find that sometimes they have done and said certain things themselves that they thought were okay or just part of society or just the way it always was.
Yeah.
By doing that. This is part of your program.
Yeah, and I should say it, to say it's not getting you back now you can sit, not at all, because I just don't come from that place in this work. But I think that if we all wanted to come together about it and honor and respect each other, it's a very fast way to have things like you just described happen. So for example, women, and especially women of color, will often talk about being the only, and what they're talking about is, I was the only woman, or the only woman of color, or a black gentleman, for example, I quote, I was the only black person in that room. It happens all the time. And so one experience you can have in here is being the only. In a room full of people completely different from you, and how utterly disoriented and disorienting that feeling is.
Because in the beginning they must feel uncomfortable and not connected and can't relate and almost...
wait, where are all my homies, and how did this, ooh, and maybe I shouldn't say anything. And that's what happens to women still, because they don't know in any given environment, especially when they're the only, necessarily, hey, who has my back in this conversation? Never mind in the room, but in those conversations I'm not part of outside the room. And as a for instance, one of the things that this work tackles as a solution is this idea called microaggressions. And I just hate phraseology, because then I think we just put it to the side. But things like this that I hear in my coaching all the time. I just got promoted. My male colleague is very irritated about that because he thought it should have been his. I am now experiencing effectively a hazing in the trench where the leader never has visibility. So there's cover, right? The leader comes in and says, everybody's, inclusive, right? And everybody goes, yeah. And then the leader goes away and says, I knew they would. And then in the trench, what happens, for example, this woman who got promoted, finds that her male colleague has worked to create relationships with these clients who he kind of already knew, and even though she's promoted, he's taking them to dinner. He's going to the sports events with them.
Golfing and what have you.
Exactly, yeah. And it's exclusionary. So let's again go right back. Those are microaggressions, but what happens to the woman's safety, shelter, esteem, belongingness? I mean, that whole first list, because of course she doesn't feel like she's safe. She feels like, who in here do I trust? And trustworthiness in all of this, and in excellence in leadership, is always at the center of the stage. So what these do is they engage men in understanding how behaviors like that, when it happens to them, dislodges them a little bit from the company and feeling like we're all copacetic here and I know where I am on the list for what's next. And we have to remember that the microaggressions, those things we talked about and could speak of more, are the things that loosen the women's connection and engagement from the company. And if you trace it all back out, it's the leader frustrated saying, what does it take? I worked like crazy to get these people. We sourced from the best places. We spent more money. What does it take for these women to be happy? Because the women aren't, and they're leaving. And what is happening is, in those trenches, without not just this, but the other kinds of experiences that men need to have to truly team with equals, it's just not happening, because it's an elective, right?
So you go in, you work with folks, and are there different levels of the work? Is there like, okay, once you master this, then we're going to move on to this level? How does it work from there?
Thank you. The idea is that first we want to get people to understand exactly what the problem is we're working on. Then we want to show when you make the changes and you make them the right way, you're going to be a more competitive organization. And then you step through, like you would very specifically, the piece for leadership, the huge piece for learning. And learning, of course, is ongoing. And there's, by the way, buy the $500 headset and then use it for all the other learning and education that needs to happen. Women, by the way, in that learning, I feel very strongly, need to have debate skill training and strategic thinking training. Not all of them, but some of them. Then there's looking at, once we start the learning, can we roll forward with the client and advise them on the other pieces of the glue of the company? So first, how do we talk to each other? We want to work with the companies on something called 7 Essential Conversations, but it's built on a foundation of, gee, if we did all this learning, but we didn't help people then get over the discomfort of like, starting from should I hold the door for you to what does it mean like if I mentor you, what are the parameters? So in 7 Essential Conversations, we're teaching the organization as a seminar how to give feedback, how to receive feedback under a banner of an idea called call me in, don't call me out. And this is very important. Certainly was not I didn't come up with that great phrase, but I admire whoever it was, as I admire Tanya Burke, who's really the person who came up with Me Too in the first place. So we then want to work with the organization on its advancement of a way of talking to each other that's in this special society of people who think with dignity. Then we want to look at trust and consult on how trust is laying out and what the organization can do to build trust, because I can't tell you the heartbreak of listening to women clients who do amazing things, who are being coached by me, who will walk out of a piece of feedback with their male manager and say, I still can't tell if he has my back. And again, that's trust. So we look at that. Then we look at the back end pieces. If I'm ready, if I know how to talk about it, let me open up the networks that I'm using. And there's brilliant work on network analysis in organizations to x-ray a company and look not at what's happening on the org chart, but who's included, who's not included, who's overworked, who's undertapped with this x-ray piece. So we're really looking, I hope, at then an organization with a lot more people who are ambassadors for change. And then we're moving toward the back. There's got to be accountability. And so I brought my Gender Avenger
I noticed that too. You brought all kinds of goodies here today, huh?
Gender Avenger.
Let's show that. Yeah,
okay,
Gender Avenger.
Gender Avenger is a fantastic organization. To me, and the symbolism of why I brought it here is because until organizations actually hold managers in particular accountable for inclusivity, the need for accountability will just never, ever go away. So Gender Avenger
I like the logo too, it's cool.
It's fantastic, isn't it? Small team of very diverse people, including some men, who've developed an app. And essentially, it's the Gender Avenger mission is let's make women's voices heard and counted. And so when we think about accountability and the systems for accountability in companies, well, I can tell you right now, I think there ought to be a dignity dashboard. And I like to consult with the company on what are those measures, right? If we're gonna go through all this work, we're gonna educate from an honest platform of everybody. Let's deal everybody in, and then it's up to you to show that you mean it.
And with dignity is respect as well, right?
Well, with respect meaning you have to be as awesome a performer in your job as ever you can be, because having merely a society of people who respect each other as equal human beings is a platform from which greater performance can and must come, right? So they go together, but they're not. Lots of times people think they're one and the same, interestingly. And as you ask that, I asked a leader once, of a woman of a very large insurance company, what was her, she was giving a talk, and I just said, well, how do you think of dignity? And she said, well, I think of it as respect, and I think of it as listening. And the idea that she really didn't, she doesn't have to share my definition, but she didn't actually have one. And that just shows you how deep the need goes for what we have in terms of work to do around the belief system part. But the gender Avengers kind of, it's catchy, but it's serious. So what's happening as part of those tools of accountability, which I think only come once people have been prepared to be held accountable. That's why it's sort of the seventh step in this process, is that at conferences that are held all around the world, but certainly around the United States, it's been well known that women are not represented on the dais when it comes time for speakers. So there was this big breakthrough 2 years ago at the Consumer Electronics Show out in California, where hundreds of thousands of people are coming from around the world, and there are hundreds of speakers. And I believe the idea 2 years ago was that there were no women speakers in the entire. So Gender Avenger as an app was already there, and what happens is you have it on your phone, and you're going to an event, or you see in advance the speaker program, and you just plug in the number of women speakers on the roster, and also if there are any women keynoting, and the panels. And so if we have no women, that's called a manel. That's a problem. And their work is to say 30% of the speakers have got to be women, and of the women speakers, 30% must be of color. And I think that's a great place to start. But lots of times, so they were the effective tool to basically, they did call it out, that electronics show, which had, topless models, as had bio, which was for the life science. It's unbelievable. And things are sort of straightening up thanks to Gender Avenger. But now you'll see an update in your inbox if you're a subscriber with either an award saying thank you, you did a great job, or massive flunk. And oftentimes there's one like, you tried, but you really didn't mean it. And so the pronouncement from Gender Avenger is cloudy with a chance of patriarchy. And because again, they're very serious. Right. They're serious, but we want everybody to come together on this. And so I feel the same way about that in accountability. That's just one of the pieces.
I would imagine you are met with some resistance. How much would that be, as some would assume, possibly generational? They would assume that, that's just the way they were raised. That's how it was back then. So don't expect, Uncle Sal or whatever to change, because that's always been the way Uncle Sal has been. And he, whether he's at work or he's at home, he's going to be Uncle Sal, and he's not going to change. Talk about some of the resistance you might come across, which could come out of fear and lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
Maybe even lack of respect for themselves sometimes as well. And also some of the, if there is, generational influences in all this conversation.
It's a great question. And I think there are oftentimes men. I was with one a couple of weeks ago, a very senior executive who was like, well, the good news is, with the millennials coming in, we don't have to worry about this. And I said, just a second, have you looked at Silicon Valley, where the average age of a CEO is like 28, and there's not a woman to be found anywhere? You've got to be kidding me. And on the other side, Uncle Sal is sort of a funny person, because there are some Uncle Sals that may be so, and there's, frankly, a lot of people, women and men, who are in their 50s, say, or beyond, who are trying to get through the rest of those years, to get what was meant for retirement, and are without any of us seeing it, gripping the thing by their hands, very frightened because so much has changed in what the skills requirements are. And fairly or unfairly, people look at the next sort of round of how do we think about our reorgs, and how long has he or she been here, what are we paying them, and what's new that's coming from that person. And I'd say I have coached some of the most awesome men in that age bracket who are all for it and have been doing their own, they're just like, I get it, and I see them. I see the women on their teams. I see the women where they're, in some cases they're in the office, and in other cases, a woman wanted to work from a different state, and there was no reason for her not to do it, and she contributes brilliantly. In other cases, I've seen one situation in particular that brings me great joy, where a woman came in a large organization to run technology, which heretofore had not been run by a woman, and the women under this person now flourishing. And so you can see a mix in all kinds of different ways. But underneath all of it, those male gaze tools and the Brock Turner dads that we have who say 20 minutes of action is not a problem, that resulted in that horrific case at Stanford. It's sort of look inside and figure out, what are you believing and communicating, and are you scared? And what do you do about being scared? And on the piece of scared about, well, ultimately, what could happen? Could I lose my seat? I can tell you, it may not feel good, but going through the change of working through your mind, your beliefs, and then skilling up on this thing called inclusion actually makes you much more relevant and will have a longer path forward for your career than it does if you're that 50-year-old guy who hasn't figured out to get any women on his team. That's the thing that's sticking up right now, saying obsolete. And that's the high-risk place to hang out.
Because a lot of men were raised and taught to be the ones that slay the dragon, the ones that if I show any vulnerability or give an inch, then I'm not a man anymore. I'm not living up to what I'm supposed to be as a guy. And that's something that really you're addressing in so many different levels.
It's so true. And so, for me, that's, Gloria Steinem had once said, let's get everybody together to unlearn some things that just weren't constructive in the first place. And there's a lot of data, some of which I have put in this book, in advocacy for men because of the tiny box and sort of, set of parameters of what life should be based on the things that you just said. And in the end, there was a fellow that had written in the revolution of the late 60s and 70s about men in society and said, it is the most unfulfilling experience I can think of to try to always be one up to somebody, and have somebody one down from me, because at the end it's an unwinnable game, right? There's always going to be a one-up.
It's never going to, right.
Yeah, it's never going to end. And the flip side to that great question is that, so what are women watching in all the storytelling? And they're watching the same stuff too, because those are the games to play. And so women also come in, right, with this thing we spoke of earlier, which it's imposter syndrome, right? This confidence crevice. It's not a gap, it's a crevice as compared to many of their male counterparts. And it's because they dress the part and they sound the part and they're educated to the part, but inside they don't believe they are the part.
Right.
Yeah, and that
lack
too.
of confidence and becomes evident, self-worth. How about in terms of women and maybe some of their shifts in thinking and the way that they're changing as well and evolving in terms of maybe years ago they thought that they had to do certain things in order to be welcomed, accepted, to become one of the boys. Maybe it was in terms of dress code or just certain ways that maybe they softened the voice or certain things that they did. Not that they enjoyed even doing it, but they thought that's the only way I was going to get any attention, any response from the male community in order to have a career or to be able to get through life. There's been a shift there as well, right? People saying, enough is enough. I'm not doing that. That's not me, and I'm not going to be asked to do that.
Another incredible question. Thank you for that. It's really interesting where women fit in this entire mix, because in truth, they're not all ready to jump in with their megaphone and go for the kinds of things that we've been talking about today, which some are and some are not. And so let's bifurcate it, but know that that's not even fair, because it's way more nuanced than that. But for the women who show up with confidence and are ready to go, what we can say is that, like if you looked at guardrails of behavior for gentlemen in organizations, they're about this wide. Guardrails for women are probably about this wide. And so in that space, and I'm talking here for Caucasian women, the confident ones whose voices are ready to go have to be looking around to see, is my leadership creating a culture where my lanes are open enough for me to really be that awesome, empowered person that I am? And then go, right? Because otherwise, they get executive coaching that they're too aggressive. Right. So that whole thing is going on. And then sort of two more gradients. For our sisters, African American in particular, the guardrails are only this wide. And so for these gifted women, ready to lead, incredibly well educated, and statistically, through the studies that we're seeing now, often much more ready to skip past imposter syndrome and be ready to lead, we've got these folks sort of parked curbside while all this other stuff is going on. And it would do CEOs very well to examine carefully what's getting communicated to these women in performance assessments, where are they showing up in succession planning. And I can tell you, I have heard myself from this group of women of color, so capable, so ready to go, so able to add incredible things to the company and business performance. They go in to ask for a raise, and the male manager says, "A raise? You are so lucky you're here." And that's such a fail. So that's all going on in the mix of this too, where we see both sides needing to come together and do work. So the women, I think in the Inclusion Institute part, the learning part, what we're trying to do is, on the one hand, help men open the lanes and get past that lie that, women should only be like this and, should dressed in pink and all that. And then for the women, that's why I've decided a critical piece of curriculum has to be this annual debate club that you join, because my successful women leaders have taught me that debate training in particular, either in high school or in their law school experience or somewhere else, or leadership in a girls' organization growing up, so it might be Girl Scouts, a couple of women have told me that. These positions earlier in life prepare you to just come and be, and you just may never have had a question as a young person or now as a woman at work of like, what am I waiting for? I'm ready to go.
Right.
And what
you
we just have
held
to
back on your
do.
opinion. You just didn't reveal your real true thoughts and your opinions because you didn't think you would be allowed to, or anybody would hear it.
Or if you did, what we sometimes hear is the knives come out of the bushes after 5 o'clock. And so who is she to be, and I'm ashamed for all of us to say that both genders are sometimes involved in that, effectively taking down a woman that seems too powerful.
Have you personally ever experienced this yourself in your career and in your jobs?
I think I didn't see it until I had come out of my 10 years in corporate life, but I saw it immediately when I started coaching people of color in my early coaching. But what I did see, one night when I was doing the Microaggressions part of the book, I said, can we just ever so quickly, whoever's around, 10 minutes, send me quickly either voicemail, email, or FaceTime, give me examples of a microaggression, because I want them to be truthful. I want them to be real. So I'm seeing.
And how do you define what that is, a microaggression?
It's a great, thank you.
Is that like getting only a little mad?
That's a great.
Yeah. Define that for us.
That's why I shouldn't be using that word, because it does that.
Yeah.
This is an example of one. A microaggression is something that's like not so egregious as to have placed you, in a situation where sexual assault occurred.
Right.
But there was such harassment cloaked in something that was pretty much passive that people could look the other way or only you saw it. So microaggression really is, I got the promotion as a woman, you, my colleague, decided to reach up over me to this band of people with whom I should have relationships and develop your own. One, to disempower me and make me question myself. That happens all the time. And then wonder who I can trust. But also, when I was in my first job, and this, I think, sorry to say, any young woman can tell you this is true. I worked in a hospital, and I was head of public relations. And one day, I heard my name paged on the
PA system.
The PA, thank you. And I went into the person's office, and it was a CFO in this organization who I sat down, and he literally presented me with a pair of women's underwear and said, "Did you know where this came from?" And, you know, like so many women, I did this thing called I froze. Because it's so against anything. I was there looking at what was my press release going to be.
Right.
And this is this guy totally...
He had a different version of public relations there.
It's unbelievable. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about, where he's so, you know, powerful in the organization, you're afraid to tell anybody, and you do freeze a lot of times with that. You're like, it's so disorienting. And people need to understand that when someone doesn't necessarily speak up right away and say that's wrong, don't for a minute interpret that as it's okay.
How did you handle that?
Not well. I left. I think I laughed my way through it.
So this was a teachable moment for you.
It was emblematic, you know, for the rest of my life. And when you ask any young woman now, so has anything ever happened? I don't tell them, what has anything happened that's been inappropriate from a man? Every single woman can give you 3, 4, 5, 6. You know, we were supposed to be going to a business lunch, but nobody else came, and then it turned into drinks, and then it to...
Flirtatious, all this other stuff sometimes.
Yeah,
well,
or hey, let me handle this with the CEO. You know, I don't think you're ready.
Right.
And that's a microaggression, because it's cheating you out of your own visibility with, and I've seen that many times, with the president, who then doesn't have a handle on how good you're doing with your work. Because somebody else took that limelight away from you. It's a broad range of things, all of them intended to put a one-up, one-down situation with the power.
What was the writing process like for you with this book when you decided to put, you know, pen to paper and really put this all together? How'd you get started, and what was that process like for you? I'm sure it was very eye-opening and revealing as you were going along.
Yeah, it was. I lost, it was a 3-year journey. I lost, in a way, I guess I wouldn't say it was a lost year, but the first year I started the research for part 1, which was like, what's the problem here? And became so almost paralyzed by the things that happen to women in this world today and how much impunity men have for what they do, that I thought, I'll start writing with it, I'll start figuring it out. Men need to know this, of course, and this is a book to be read by men. And by the end of the first year, I called some colleagues, including a gentleman who's very active, working this space very hard. And his name is Michael Kaufman, he's a Canadian. And I said, I think I have to throw a year's worth of work out. And I told him what it was, and he said, he wasn't discouraging me, but he said, I'm not sure the world is ready for some of those links yet. So then I started again, and I took what was this, really to this, for part 1 of why do we have this problem, and then I feel like I really got, you know, into it. And then for everything I decided to include up front, I decided it had to have a payoff of an answer in the second part, the part 2, or it was doing nothing, really, because we don't all need to, I mean, women don't need to really read this book unless they're reading it to give to their CEO. And so that's really what happened, and then I got it. But it was humbling, and as I said, a little bit paralyzing. I was like, wow, I learned a lot, and I was discouraged by a lot, but then you really meet the people who are changing things.
Right.
And you say, wait a minute,
They don't have the limelight as much right now, but slowly, hopefully. You start with understanding the gender bias, the myths behind the beliefs.
Yeah.
There's a lot of myths, huh?
There are a lot of myths out there, right? That's so true. And in our culture, in particular, in the U.S., we know what those myths and beliefs are. And so all the things that you delineated as a man that you know just as well as I do. And it's funny because if you do look at, isn't this just everywhere? You can look to Iceland and also Rwanda, which is doing better than the U.S. in terms of representation of women in government, by the way. And if I just came back to, I'm proud of Rwanda and I'm proud of Iceland, but Iceland, the thing that's so interesting is their beliefs and their mythologies that go way, way back, which is where so much of this comes from, includes women goddesses as well as male gods. And there's something very meaningful about that, because all of the ancient books where the answer is supposed to be all exclude women, unless they're bearing a child. And so I just think that there's so much we can learn and see from other places, and then also tell you that there's work every day in Iceland to keep it going.
To keep it going. When people come from other countries here and they start their careers with America being the land of the free and opportunity and everything, I'm sure there's probably shock and awe when they realize it's not as necessarily freeing or open or equitable as they would think coming over from other lands to immerse themselves in our culture, right?
I think it's very true. And it's funny enough, the people I think that come with that expectation, we actually lost that window because it's so well known and understood now that the U.S. Doesn't, for example, like Norway or any of the countries that are, yes, thank you, the Scandinavian countries, where I have friends who I coached in life sciences who are on 3 and 4 and 5 boards, women, and it's very normal there. It's a very normalized thing, and their comments are, every time I get back off the plane and land in the U.S., I see it getting worse.
Not better.
Yeah, and so this is what happens. And then the next step is there's a requirement that people get angry about. For example, in California, well, we need to have 30% women on corporate boards. And where do those things come from? It comes from the failure of people in power to get on board with the fact that, we're in a new era now where there are more women with degrees than men, and we will either have it happen because it's legislated, or we can have it happen because we understand what it means to be a person who realizes her and his responsibility, truly, what it really means to lead, to connect with someone's soul and be responsible for how they conduct and govern themselves in the course of doing work for your business.
And even leadership as a whole has been going through a major transformation as well in terms of how the leader is defined and how they operate, in terms of the boss in the ivory tower who wasn't engaged with the rest of the staff or the employees, and really looking at the inbox for suggestions or the productivity of the employees. It was all to satisfy the bottom line. And now I think they're realizing that an effective leader across the board, female, male, all of the above, is one that does roll up the sleeves, gets involved, listens to all levels of staffing, and listens to suggestions, brings people together, is mentoring and inspiring. There's a whole shift there that's happening that is monumental as well, right?
Very much so. I mean, and now there's sort of an argument about, well, do we really have to be that good at all that stuff? Because with artificial intelligence coming and robotics and stuff, maybe this whole thing will be passé. And I would argue the contrary, which is everything that's being developed from a technology perspective is now sort of being put through this lens in the technology of how do we get people to work together to make this go. None of these things are going away. And what I just can assure leaders is that I like to ask leaders to look inside themselves and say, am I really, am I up for what this job is asking of me, which is engage, inspire, certainly align people around something so special that they feel free enough and safe enough and belonging enough to do really cool things together. And I've seen it with my own eyes when when those teams open up and people feel safe and secure enough to problem solve and do those kinds of things that create economic advantage in the marketplace. But boy, oh boy, I tell you, one way or the other, if it's not gender avenger, if it's not legislation, if it's not shareholders, if it's not the board, if it's not your own employees saying, what's happening here? My advice is you will do well by doing good in this space all the way around, and you better start learning quick. I think this book is a great start.
It's a good start.
Yeah.
You also offer in part 2, which you alluded to a little bit, is this dignity mindset toolkit. So you arm people with this toolkit to help them along the way. Talk about the toolkit a little bit more. What is it? How do you define what it is?
Yeah, in a way, it's a starter kit, really. Every organization is going to have 7 structures, at least, but I think these are probably the right ones, where a change effort needs to get sort of pushed through as part of something that's going to be a permanent part of how we do business going forward. I use the analogy of agile, right, and how much money and effort is spent helping organizations adopt the agile way of doing business, which is faster and more sort of responsive, off your feet, and less reliant on traditional organization hierarchy and so forth. This is the same. This needs the same work. The CEO needs to get on board and learn. And so it is those 7 pieces. The leader's journey and her or his communication of a belief system after that journey, and a willingness to be vulnerable, and teaching what does vulnerability look like in a person who was always taught his whole life never to show it, in fairness to all those guys. The second is how we teach and learn. And that's all of our work in the Inclusion Institute for Women and Men. The third is how we communicate by calling each other in, not calling each other out. The fourth is trust. The fifth is how we recruit, right? And those things that we don't want to get recruiting ahead of people's having a belief system, because then we're recruiting people who come in and stay for a year and say, this place is nothing like it sold me on. I'll see ya.
Yeah, gone.
And then finally, accountability. So 7 tools to help an organization get started in the pieces that have to be working in a rollout, so that the organization can move towards this place of economic advantage and opportunity.
So this Inclusion Institute, is this something where you go through it, you take it all, you absorb it, and then you're done? Or do you come back for more? Are you updated? Is it something that you should check in with and consistently be a part of for refreshers and things of that nature?
Super question. In organization life, I actually entered organization life thinking I was done after my MBA. I was like, oh,
I've got it
that
all.
was very strenuous. Yeah,
That's
and
it.
I am so happy.
Now I'm an expert at everything.
Now
Right.
I'm an expert. And then sadly learned quickly, and now it's the field I'm in, that you have to be learning all the time, and now really learning quickly to stay relevant and not become obsolete, which is happening in a faster and faster way to people who thought they were really, playing with every single cylinder engaged. So learning is ongoing. Number one, for any client I coach, I believe deeply they ought to have a 3-year rolling learning plan to begin with, which is, what did I learn last year and what objective was it tuned against for my relevance, right? For the need I can continue to meet for this organization. What's the plan this year? And for these, how did I measure it? How do I know it mattered? What did people say? And then one for next year. And that 3-year plan is, number one, it's the inoculation against obsolescence, unless you decide, oh, I see what I'm going to have to learn, and I don't want to do that. And in this case, I'm opting out because inclusion is an elective. Big mistake. So yeah, and the Inclusion Institute, and specifically to your question, learning is ongoing. And so every responsible organization has folks with learning plans every year that come from a performance plan. What are you going to have to learn to do this? Because this should be growth. We all have to grow, or we're not going to. And so in the Inclusion Institute, you can start with a baseline. For example, take the free, it's out of Harvard, but it's the implicit bias test. And the idea is all of us carry biases. Of course we do. Let's find out what our biases are as part of all, entering in this together, and then come into the Inclusion Institute with a baseline of where my learning ought to work. And so in that space, in the Inclusion Institute in particular, we're consulting to help organizations build out what they need to have to help cover the parts and pieces. But a big piece of what we've been talking about today, especially the restoration of empathy for men and an understanding of what's the rationale for me making space for these people. And, oh, by the way, I don't respect them. I didn't realize that, but I actually really don't. And some women come out that way too. So working that and then coming back and coming back and coming for all the things we need to continue to learn, both on the IQ side and on the EQ side. And there's this saying that IQ gets you in the door and EQ either gets you up or gets you out. And the Inclusion Institute's heavy emphasis is on the EQ side, right? The emotional intelligence, though the debate skills training, which is to support women feeling confident holding the floor, because so much of the data I've collected on confidence issues is women not feeling confident, speaking up, just to the point you had made, yeah? And also, if we want then strategic thinking and communicating, which ironically, when I look at why do my male clients have so much more of that than some, but not all, of my female clients, a lot of it's in the video games.
Sure, absolutely. How much does emotional intelligence play into this? Now, when I talk about IQ intelligence, the emotional, being touched with the understanding and in touch with emotional intelligence.
When you are high in emotional intelligence, a couple things are true. One, you understand and have high self-awareness of how you are showing up and how other people experience you in that moment. And then sort of they always say the magic two parts of it at its foundation are, I'm highly self-aware. I know how I'm thinking, talking, behaving affects others. And I, secondly, can regulate myself to an alternate way when I sense that one of those ways that's not productive may be starting to show up in my words, behavior, demeanor. And so very concretely, I can tell you that there are times when men have shown up in meetings. A gentleman was explaining this to me recently at a senior leadership team meeting where we did this work, and said he had seen it years and years ago in a mixed group setting where they were off-site doing like an outward bound kind of thing. And this person had come from a culture where a lot of screaming and demanding, the more powerful your voice, the more deep, the more important you were.
And that's just at their Sunday dinner table.
Exactly.
In certain houses.
Isn't it true? Yeah, exactly. And so he had no idea that when people, everybody would leave the room one by one, and the people in the room would then sort of talk about what was their experience from an EQ perspective on this player and how they affected the environment in the room. And came back in the room to find out some of the women were crying. This was told to me by someone who had the experience. And what you see is unchecked in a male world with male rules, that doesn't get stopped or checked. And so what happens is the contributions of these talented, the places I work, I am one of the luckiest people ever. It's very highly educated people with a lot of intellectual gift that's not ever getting off across the transom because one style of doing things is sort of cutting all of that out. So on the EQ side, there's a lot for men to learn about how their style needs to change to be inclusive. I think paradigm, from what I understand in coaching these fellas, is, it's like how do I sort of manage the whole politics of one up, one down with the other men in this system, and the occasional woman that in there on an org chart someplace. But it's really about that. And what we're saying is that's not the paradigm anymore. The paradigm is your job as a leader from wherever you sit and stand is, did everybody communicate in this meeting? And did you get some good ideas from people as well as feel welcome to offer your own? And if that didn't happen, that's a failure in action. And one of the things I think that leaders kind of at the top hear about, but they don't see. Right. And this is why, unless leadership really puts this toolkit in place it's just going to be resisted over and over again in the trenches.
You know, I would imagine that a lot of what we're talking about, which is geared towards the business world and leadership, also then sort of, it can really lend itself to your life relationships with everybody, really.
Yeah.
I mean, your social relationships with friends, how you work with your family, loved ones, spouses, partners. These are all transferable understandings and methodologies, techniques, and skills, right?
Very much so. I mean, even if we took this topic off the table, I think a lot of people who I engage with for executive coaching often say, and I encourage them, try this with your family, try these. They'll say, oh my gosh, it's so helpful in all of these places. I once also, what's good for the goose, right? I had often taught my kids some of the tools as they're growing up, and one of them is how you listen, and it's got these 5 levels, and level 1 is you're zoned out. So the idea is your body is here, but your mind is elsewhere. And every once in a while, one of my kids will say, Mom, are you level 1 listening to me right now? And they're right, and maybe I was, but to hold ourselves to the standards why would they be different really on these core issues of what it really means to show up and function as a decent, good human being, and to bring more of that into the world. It's 100% absolutely right.
Because that's one of the first things when we did the radio show together, and I interviewed you on radio, on CUTV News Radio, that first came to mind for me is that these are things that are phenomenal for the business climate, but also in everyday life. These tools and this research you've done and the suggestions that you have are perfect for just day-to-day living.
It turns out to be true, and it's funny, I have people with the first book I had written, which was about leadership branding, they'll come up to me after a seminar or after they read the book or send me a note and say, the first thing I did was buy 3, one for each of my kids. And this made me, actually was very rewarding to hear that and very fulfilling. But I hope very much that this book, though, the life we're living right now isn't one that's prioritizing dignity for every soul. That our culture's not offering that in all of its manifestations, all of them. And that includes a big, big bunch of people making billions and billions of dollars on hate platforms.
Sure. It's a whole other area that's developed. Yeah.
You bet. So, I mean, hate goes somewhere. Threats against women who report the truth that frighten them to death. These are all, again, the things that make their safety needs threatened. And so we had to remember that in a world today, in USA Today, they did a beautiful piece on Domestic Violence Month and ran through the statistics of what it would be like for one day in this country where women were not struck, slapped, hit by men, by their male partners. And the statistics were, you had a chill. I mean, I think it's every 4 hours there's a woman who dies. I could be wrong, and it might be more frequently in a day.
Even if it's one, that's
even
too many.
if it's one, it's too many.
Right.
And why ever would we want to promulgate an 8,000-year-old myth about males needing power and control that manifests in beating up and harming a woman, and of course, the children who then grow up to be the product of that warped, horrible belief system. And so, to think about, social things like domestic violence, first of all the impact
bullying
that it has on,
that,
all the things that it does to a human being that takes that person away from being a happy, productive participant in society, and all the systems, what we do, we set up systems to help them once it happened. We don't have the guts in this country to stop it. Right. And so it's all accommodating, right? It's all accommodation behavior. If you think about
treating the symptom but not the cause.
Exactly. And it's because it's easier to cling to the old belief system, and there are unfortunate consequences of that. But let's put that aside. I think it would be interesting to say that, if you were a man and stepped through a day of what it looked like to be a battered woman. And it's a pretty terrifying experience, and it would really change some things. And so hopefully, even though VR, the concern right now is that there's gender bias, there's racial bias built into it, which there is. There are incredible organizations and women and coders, but Stanford's doing a lot of work to use it, and along with training companies for social good. And I just think, if you looked even back at the way we closed out the book, which was to say, let's look at what happened if the pay gap in the United States was closed. And as I have not the memory for those statistics, what I can tell you is if you looked at what happens to Social Security in this country, first of all, the bin goes from threatened to people using it for all these other pet projects to full and funded for all the people who are going to need it, at least for the people in the workforce now, whether they're 22 or 65, that paid into it.
Right.
It grows because the pay gap was closed. And other incredible social benefits that come with treating people fairly, including people of color, and especially, our African American brothers and sisters who, to whom this book was dedicated, to my African American women clients and others who I actually understood. Actually, it hit my soul watching how they conduct themselves with the courage and the brave face and the tenacity to get up every day and walk through a life you and I will never have an idea of unless we can really try to see it, and still come to work and be one of the most dignified contributors on the team. So there's so much that we miss by excluding such special and gifted people.
What do you hope people get out of the book, the result of this effort, this research, this work? What do you hope they're left with when they read The Dignity Mindset?
Well, from a mercenary perspective, I hope that their first call is to me to please come in and give a talk at their organization, because I do think that what my mission was to create a message that could meet the people who need to hear it. And so I've got a presentation that I have delivered to leadership teams, which have elicited, in a very constructive, non-defensive way, which is not helpful to anybody, comments from these gentlemen saying, oh my God, and then this one individual sharing an experience he had where just no idea how women were treated. So the very first thing I wrote it for was, I have so much passion for us coming together as the people I know we can and often want to be to start to solve this problem. And two, after that people have what they need, that I didn't just come in and get everybody, one, energized and then excited and then say, go figure it out.
Right.
I think, one of the things that was once told me very young, and I hope it's still true, I have a chance to go in my mind from very high level to a detail and get things done. And I think this book will help you get it done. And I that's what I hope my legacy through this book will actually be.
Why is this so important to you, and why does this really reflect in the DNA who you are as a person? This is really a passion that is taking you through all this research and all this dedication to this in ways, because it's life-changing for many people. Yeah. And it is legacy building, as you're saying. Why do you love this work so much?
I haven't really talked about this much, but I grew up in a house of parents with great intentions. One was a Roman Catholic, it's my mom, and my dad was not. While I think they were presented with challenges with one of my siblings very early on that were filled with sorrow, as a kid I understood that I had two polar opposite parents. One that was saying, my mom, that was not a very Christian thing to do, and to teach us right and wrong and ethics in that way. And the other who was using all of those words to describe women and people of color, one and the other in the same room. And I did date a person of color, an African American in high school, and he was the bomb. And my father, one evening after the door closed, quite frankly, slapped me and sent me across the room. And it wasn't really that bothered me. And as I've gotten older, I have understood and softened on their sorrows and things like that. But I have not softened on the joy of when friends of all different colors come into a room, and the happiness, and all through the difference, and the laughing, and the inner sorrow I feel when I have the honor to coach these people, and then know that only some of all that they can be and do, not just for the company, but for the families they support and the generations relying on them and the generations to come. I want that to be different, and it comes from that very moment.
It's amazing. When you go back deep enough, there's always that initial spark, right?
There is.
And then but what you've done is you've taken that spark and you've run with it because you want to really seriously help others and change our mindset more towards a dignity mindset, which is really important, I think, in all aspects of life, whether it is at work or just, at home or talking to somebody in the supermarket. It's really, really important. It's wonderful work that you're doing, Susan.
Thank you.
It really is life-changing work, and I hope people do pick up the book, this Leader's Guide and a Reader's Guide.
That's right.
It is a page turner, and it's almost like a self-help book in certain ways because there's so much you're left with that can really enrich you as a person, and you get so excited about it, you want to then pay it forward and share it with others, which is part of your mission as well, right?
It really is, and a reason to come here and be with you today is I know you will have read that book when I come here, and I know you will understand these things and be able to have, to me, an ideal conversation about the realities of it, and also, notwithstanding those realities, the hope and promise for what could be through it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Continued success and continued this great work. We wish you nothing but the best, Sue. You are making tremendous strides in all of this, and you have already. And we wish you just nothing but the best. Thanks for coming for this interview today.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Jim.
It was
an
a
honor.
real pleasure.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
If you'd like to learn more and get a copy of Susan's book, The Dignity Mindset, A Leader's Guide to Building Gender Equity at Work, visit her website, thepersonalbrandcompany.com. Her book is also available at Amazon.com as well. For CUTV News, I'm Jim Masters. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.